Hello and welcome to today's webinar, the 2019 Hurricane Season Outlook. My name is Christine Hunt, your moderator for today's event. Joining me today, we have Stephen Strum, Meteorologist and Vice President of Extended Forecast Services at DTN, Michael Gauthier, Senior Consultant at DTN, and Greg Mummah, Product Expert at Everbridge. At the end of today's event, we will answer questions from the audience. Please use the question control panel to enter your questions throughout the presentation. Now, without further delay, here is Stephen Strum.
Thanks, Christine, and good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started here, taking a look at the upcoming forecast for the 2019 hurricane season. We've seen a couple storms so far this year, but really we're still not quite to the heart of the season, so the bulk of the activity obviously is still ahead of us at this point in the year. But we're going to talk about, first off, a recap of what happened last year, look at the historical perspective in terms of long-term trends of tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes, that kind of thing. Look at some of the main drivers for the 2019 hurricane season, including some model outlooks, and then we'll go ahead and present our own forecast for this hurricane season. So first off, a recap of the 2018 season. On the right-hand side, you can see a map there showing the tracks of every single storm that developed last year. We saw 15 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 2 of those major hurricanes, those being Florence and Michael. Both of those were very powerful hurricanes, although Florence had weakened prior to making landfall and only made landfall as a Category 1, while Michael actually made landfall at its peak intensity, reaching Category 5 strength right at landfall. So both powerful storms, only one made landfall as a major hurricane, and Michael was actually only the 4th hurricane to make landfall as a Category 5 in U.S. history, the others being Camille, Andrew, and the Labor Day hurricane back in 1935. So pretty rare to see a Category 5 make landfall, and only the second Category 5 to make landfall outside of southern Florida as well. So certainly not a typical storm for the U.S., but certainly a major impact nonetheless across Florida, since we have not seen a storm like that for a number of years. And overall last year, we did see $50 billion in damage as a result of those landfalling storms, and that's even with the fact that those storms did not make landfall in the sort of worst case scenario areas where we had a higher population. So had those storms been a little bit farther, or a little bit different in their landfall location, hitting a major urban area, those damage totals would have been dramatically higher. So looking at historical trends here to kind of get an idea of how things have been going over the last century or so, you can see here is a trend of landfalling hurricanes across the continental U.S. And for the most part, there's not been a really any significant trend. The actual trend is slightly down because we did have that sort of large gap between 2005 and 2016-17 where we didn't really see a lot of activity in terms of hurricanes making landfall. We had plenty of hurricanes and major hurricanes, they just didn't hit the U.S. at that during that interval to any great degree, and so we have had a slight downward trend as a result of that. But you can see really over time, there's not really any significant trend. For the most part, most years see a couple hurricanes make landfall. There's years in between here and there that don't see a hurricane make landfall, but no real overall major trend in terms of landfalling storms. And same thing with major hurricanes. Again, those do not happen every single year in terms of making landfall across the U.S. Most years see a major hurricane in the Atlantic somewhere, if not 2 or 3. But not all of those obviously hit the U.S. And you can see typically we'll see a year or two with a major hurricane and then a few years without one. And that's been kind of the pattern over time. And occasionally we see years like 2004 and 5 where we have several major hurricanes make landfall. And this graph doesn't show 2018 on it, but obviously we had one more major landfall last year as well. But we noticed that we had that major gap there between 2005 and 2017 where we went that entire stretch without a major hurricane making landfall along the U.S. coast, which was a record stretch. Not anything that we've seen, since records have been kept since around 1900. So certainly an unusual stretch of quieter weather across the U.S. coast. But we've seen that change the last 2 years, and odds are we're going to see that sort of more active, or really just a more typical trend continue going forward here as we head through this season and likely into the next couple of years as well. Now, looking at the overall trends for the Atlantic Basin as a whole, you can see here the number of tropical storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes. And the main thing here is that we saw this dramatic uptick around the middle 90s. And since then, we've been far more active than the years prior to the middle 90s. And that in large part is the result of a overall warmer Atlantic Basin around the middle 90s, we saw the Atlantic Basin warm quite a bit, and we've been, for the most part, consistently warmer than average, at least warmer than that, longer-term 30-year average across the Atlantic Basin during that time period. And the warmer water has resulted in more storms reaching tropical storm and hurricane strength, because it has more fuel to feed off of that. And so we've seen this general uptick in overall, trends in storms. And we've also, obviously, we have better technology. And so there are storms today that get identified as tropical storms that wouldn't have, 30, 40, 50 years ago, just because we didn't have the ability to detect them to the degree that we do today. So that's part of it as well. But for the most part, you can see, though, that we've been in a consistently more active period since 95. And again, until we see a dramatic change in ocean temperatures in the Atlantic Basin, that's not likely to change to any great degree. So the overall historical, or the important factors here looking at the historical trends, is that we've seen, excluding the last 2 years, we've seen generally fewer landfalling hurricanes than the overall long-term average. And we had that stretch between October 2005 and August 2017 without a major hurricane making landfall. But we've had 3 since then. And again, the overall average is we typically see a major hurricane about once a year make landfall, looking at the long-term historical trends. And so that period of time without a major hurricane landfall was not the normal. The normal is that we do typically see one of those make landfall about once a year. And so, that's sort of what you have to kind of expect going forward, not the lack of hurricanes making landfall that we saw during that long stretch of time. And obviously the impacts do vary considerably depending on exactly where they happen. Sandy, for example, it's kind of a borderline, hurricane when it made landfall, but it did so in a very populated area. It was very slow moving. And Harvey was sort of the same scenario where it was a stronger hurricane, but also the fact that it was very slow moving, it impacted a major urban area, and both of those storms produced major damage totals as a result of that. So obviously where is more important sometimes than how strong in terms of the storms, and so that's always a key factor going forward. And then obviously, if we do see landfalls and overall intensities kind of match a long-term trend and not that sort of period of quiet that we saw between 2005 and 2017, we should expect to see overall higher damage totals across the U.S. and larger, expenses in terms of losses going forward in time as we see, a return to sort of that long-term average going forward in the coming several years. So looking at the actual forecast and factors, first off, where we are so far, we've seen 2 named storms this year, one hurricane, that being Barry. And the graph on the right there shows that we don't really typically get into the heart of the hurricane season until the middle of August, and we're just sort of on the cusp of the active part of the hurricane season. So by and large, the vast bulk of activity occurs between the middle of August and the middle of October, and we're not quite there yet, but we are going to see conditions usually ramp up from this point forward, peaking around the middle of September, and then slowly ramping down during the course of the following 6 weeks or so. But by and large, 80, 90% of your activity typically occurs in that August to October timeframe, and we typically only see a couple of storms to this point in time of the season. So we're pretty much right about average at this point, but again, the vast bulk of activity is still ahead of us. So factors for this upcoming hurricane season, we have had a weakening El Nino. Typically, when we see an El Nino, we see less activity than average in the Atlantic Basin. However, that El Nino has been fading, and this is a graph of forecast water temperature anomalies for the next 3 months. And you can see that we do see most of the eastern tropical Pacific actually trending cooler. And so really an end to the El Nino is upon us. And so that will no longer be a factor in terms of suppressing activity. And typically when we do see neutral ENSO conditions or La Nina, we tend to see an enhancement of activity across the Atlantic Basin. Also, we have the warm phase of the PDO and a neutral AMO phase. And again, those SST anomalies can also impact the atmospheric circulation that has an impact on wind shear and things like that, which can impact our overall storm totals. Now, looking at El Nino here first, this is a plot here on the left showing a variety of forecast models. The red line that goes kind of across from left to right around the 0.5 mark is sort of the standard threshold for El Nino. And on average, about roughly half the models are suggesting we'll see a continuation of weak El Nino conditions through the upcoming fall, and about half sort of show a continued weakening trend towards neutral or even towards weak La Nina as we head through the fall season. But the overall trend has been for the models to sort of trend weaker with, or basically trend lower with the forecast. And so we're seeing more of the models kind of trending towards neutral and La Nina with time. And that trend will likely continue based on current observations. And so the bottom line is that we're not likely to see much influence from El Nino during the heart of the hurricane season. Most likely we'll be in a solidly neutral ENSO phase, and that typically does promote more activity than average across the tropical Atlantic. Now, looking at ENSO influences overall, this table here shows the average number of named storms and hurricanes and major hurricanes for a variety of sort of possibilities. Here we have all years since 1950 and all years since 95 as kind of like your baselines. And then we have things broken down by El Nino, neutral ENSO, and La Nina. The larger numbers in the middle are the averages, and then the smaller numbers represent the range in terms of the fewest and most storms that we've seen during those types of patterns. And so the key thing here is that during the El Nino years that you see, even from 95, onward, those years typically see the fewest number of named storms, hurricanes, and major hurricanes, whereas the years that have seen neutral ENSO conditions or La Nina typically see the greatest number of named storms and hurricanes, and the average for a neutral ENSO year is about 16 named storms, whereas for an El Nino it's only 11. So definitely a big increase when you see neutral ENSO, and we are trending that way currently with the El Nino that we've had the last year or so fading away at this point in time. So the ENSO influence would suggest that we should see something, in that, 14 to 16 named storm range just by that alone. Now, as we go forward here, looking at some other factors, looking at analog years, these are years that, at least back in the spring, heading into the hurricane season, were sort of years that had similar SST patterns across the world that we kind of focus on, or in the regions that we focus on. And so what we're looking at here was trying to get an idea of where the storm tracks typically were during those years. And there was overall a higher than average number of storms during those years that moved into the Gulf of Mexico or towards the southeastern portion of the U.S. So in general, those years had a higher tendency for storms to make landfall across the southeastern quadrant of the country in general. And so that will be something to look forward to as we head through the remainder of this hurricane season. And also here, as we look at just sort of the straight averages, the 1981 to 2010 long-term 30-year averages for 12 named storms and 6.5 hurricanes. But neutral ENSO years by themselves, if you look at just, since 95, we've averaged 16 storms per year and 8 hurricanes, so above that long-term average. And the analog years had similar ENSO patterns, at least back heading into the summer, had an average of 13, a little over 13 and a little bit over 7 hurricanes. And so, however, some of those years saw El Nino conditions persist through the hurricane season. And so we're seeing that El Nino fade away here towards neutral ENSO levels. So again, odds are a little bit higher that we're going to be seeing a total that's closer to that neutral ENSO range, more so than something, like the El Nino type of average that you typically see. Now here's also some additional guidance here. The map on the left shows water temperature anomalies, and the overall consensus and what we're seeing currently as well is that water temperatures are likely to stay above normal across most of the Atlantic basin, especially across the Western Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. The deep tropics may stay a little bit closer to average like they are now, so tropical waves coming off Africa may not get going right away in some cases, but any storms that move anywhere towards the U.S. are going to have warmer than average water to work with, and so more fuel, and thus could become potentially intense fairly quickly as they get into the western part of the Atlantic basin. On the right-hand side is the other important factor, and that's wind shear. And the overall climate model projection shows that we should see there in the blue less wind shear than average across a large part of the tropical Atlantic. And so the combination of the warmer water and the expectation for lower than average wind shear would generally promote an above average level of activity during the August through October time period. Now, in terms of landfalls, that's kind of really what the key is. You can have an active season, but not very many landfalls, like we saw during that 2006 to 2016 window. And the reason for that was during that time period, we tended to have a trough of low pressure during the heart of the hurricane season over the eastern U.S., and the circulation around that trough tended to direct most of the storms in the Atlantic basin out into the middle of the Atlantic and kept them away from the East Coast and kept them from really moving into the Gulf of Mexico and impacting the Gulf Coast as well. And so that was really the main factor that kind of was steering the storms. However, if you look at what happened in 2017, and we saw more of this last year, is that we've seen a shift towards that sort of main trough area being farther west and more ridging along and off the east coast, and the circulation around that high pressure was actually steering storms towards the east coast and towards the Gulf of Mexico instead of steering them out to sea. Now, that's not the way it is, throughout the entire hurricane season. You have a lot of variation on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis, but on average, we've seen a pattern in the last couple of years that have favored a track generally more towards the U.S. as opposed to one out into the middle of the Atlantic basin. And so that's going to be the case again this year. Our analog composite again favors a ridge, pretty much persisting along the east coast. And so that circulation would tend to promote storms that do make it into the western Atlantic Ocean, likely being steered towards the east coast or into the Gulf of Mexico. And so while we're still going to see a lot of storms that, end up in the middle of the Atlantic and don't impact the U.S., likely we'll have a higher than average risk for storms to head towards the east coast, particularly from the Carolinas southward and into the central and eastern Gulf of Mexico. Those are the areas that we currently look to be focusing on for the highest risk for landfalling storms this year. And then areas farther north have more of an average risk. It's always hard to have a landfall north of North Carolina just because of the topography. But in general, the East Coast overall tends to have a higher risk in this type of overall pattern. And at the top there, you can see again our projection for named storms and hurricanes and major hurricanes for this year. Again, we're looking at 16 named storms total and 8 hurricanes, 2 so far, obviously, in terms of named storms. Last year, we saw 15 and 8, so pretty comparable to last year in terms of overall totals, fairly comparable to the 1995 to 2018 average as well, but above that long-term average. And so some key messages here before we wrap up. Again, conditions are favorable for a more active season in the Gulf and the southeastern U.S. That'll be a key area to watch for potential landfalls, although the entire East Coast does have a somewhat heightened risk this year just because we are likely going to have more storms at least tracking in that direction this year. And again, most analog years and neutral enso conditions typically have seen higher than average numbers of storms. And so we are still looking to see that as well this year. We have warmer than normal water across most of the western Atlantic as well as the Gulf of Mexico. Also, the expectation for reduced wind shear across the tropical Atlantic this upcoming next few months. And so both of those, again, also support above normal levels of activity for the August through October time period. And again, for the most part, the upper level pattern does tend to favor a lot of those storms, making it farther west towards the Gulf, towards the East Coast, relative to the long-term average. That doesn't mean, again, all storms are going to do that, but the odds are we are going to see a landfalling hurricane again this year like we had the last couple of years, and not sort of a quiet period of landfalling activity like we saw in the prior decade. So again, overall, to kind of wrap things up here, again, the overall plot of where our risk areas are, again, most of the central eastern Gulf as well as the East Coast south of the Carolinas are our highest target areas for greatest potential for landfalling storms this year. And again, we're looking at a total of 16 named storms, 8 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes, fairly comparable to what we saw during the 2018 hurricane season. And so with that, I'll pass things back to Christine, and she can wrap us through the next part of the call.
Welcome, everybody. This is Mike Gothier. I'm a senior business consultant with DTN, and I'm going to just take you through a few slides that talk about how we communicate that risk that Steve mentioned. I thank Steve for that conversation. I do want to mention, I just have a few slides here, but I'm just going to mention that we do monitor all basins, all tropical regions of the world with all this same information. So if you have a multinational corporation with many, many assets around the world, we can take care of you on that. So I'll just dive in here, and then when we're all done, feel free to ask any questions, and we'll go from there. So every day we start, our clients receive a tropical planner, this is basin specific. This happens to be the Atlantic. So imagine coming into work, you get a cup of coffee. This is in your email, and you look at it, and you can share this in your organization. It's got our meteorologist discussions on there. It shows the conditions and graphics and what we're expecting and briefings. And this is just a daily product. We can update this if we need to more than once a day. Once a disturbance is indicated, we'll start getting very specific on that particular event and start really drilling into the details of where it is, its path, its intensity, its scope of wind field, satellite imagery, and those type of things. Again, this is a whole situational flow of information. We average about 50 hours earlier than most government agencies on notifying our clients of things that we see being developed. Once a storm is actually named, we'll start getting even more details on it and start providing even a richer, robust set of details on that particular storm. And we will issue these multiple times a day with any changes. It's also key to note that we run our own atmospheric models so that we can run comparisons to changes in the forecast or intensity of a storm in between official forecast guidance. So we run these high rapid refresh models, high resolution rapid refresh models on an hourly basis during tropical season, and so we can really drill down for our clients. These again contain our meteorologist discussions. We'll also get very specific on your assets, so we'll let you know how this particular tropical event will affect your location. And like I said, we do this all over the globe, both land and sea. And you can see here, we just got some very specific information with meteographs and information on a particular location. If you have multi-assets, we can tie them into a multi-asset report. We call this a multi-site threat report, which will let you have a key look at all your different assets and how the storm is going to impact that. We also have the ability, I don't show it on here, but we can tie in your business continuity plans to the forecast. So as our forecast rolls out, if you want to set a threshold trigger to implement a particular action in your organization, we can tell you that threshold has been met or when it's going to be met based upon the forecast. And we do some other very proactive things for specific companies. So my job is to sit down and analyze your business needs with you and tailor all this to fit for you. So we also have proactive consultations. During Barry, we have had numbers and numbers of phone calls with executive boards across the Gulf of Mexico here discussing the impacts of this. And again, this is not so that we can supersede national information, but it's so that we can specifically tie it into our clients' assets and locations. So decision guidance can be made. Sometimes some of these facilities, it's not the last guy out hits the light switch. There's decisions to be made many days and many hours in advance. And so again, the whole thing is to communicate risk. And if anybody has any questions on this afterwards or would like to get their hands on some of these in the demo, you can contact Everbridge afterwards. They'll get a hold of me and we can certainly hang on the line and answer questions too. So I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it back over to Everbridge and let them continue on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen and Michael. So Greg is just going to go through a couple of slides and then we'll get to our questions.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Greg Mummah. I'm a product specialist here at Everbridge, and I want to talk to you about our critical event management platform today and how we can help you manage your way through a storm system, a hurricane. With DTN, we start with great information about the storm, about the potential for damage, and really that's a feeder that feeds into the critical event management platform and helps you prepare for the storm. Then as the storm strikes, we monitor the assets, all of the people, buildings, vehicles, other things that you're concerned about for specific risk inside the hurricane, things like wind strength and storm surge. So we'll monitor those assets for risk and give you visibility into where damage may be the worst as a result of that storm. And then immediately after the storm, we'll help you triage. We'll help you understand what assets and people need to be checked on first or need the most attention in the immediate aftermath, and give you the ability really to return to normal operation as soon as you possibly can. Now, what you're seeing on the screen now is a model command center. It's at the moment, this is the CEM platform focusing on a hurricane off the coast of North Carolina. I'm sure you can imagine which hurricane that might be. This is the common operating picture that the platform provides with our assets and our risks all in one place. And I'll hover over this event right here and you can just see the storm and you can see assets on the shore. So let's talk about how we can help you as you're preparing for the system and then actually help you manage your way through the event itself. So this typically starts out with receiving excellent information from a partner like DTN. You're going to be monitoring the approach of a storm to your assets, certainly in the continental U.S. or as was mentioned elsewhere, if you have assets in other places where tropical systems often happen to hit. What Everbridge will provide for you first and foremost is the ability to understand who and what is at risk as a result of this storm as it moves into the area, whether that's your assets, suppliers, company infrastructure, whatever it may be. Now, you can also see the locations of your business continuity assets. So if you have vehicles or response teams that you need to position in the area, those can become assets that you monitor through the platform as well. Now, ideally, you've leveraged our solution to make a plan. So when a hurricane is approaching the shore, you've got a plan for how you're going to manage your way through that event. We call that a critical event, and the solution we use for that is our critical event management tool. Now, this includes all of the tasks that everyone needs to perform to prepare for the storm, as well as preset communications that you may want to send, whether that's an employee notice that, hey, we're going to be closing our facilities this day and nobody needs to come to work, and any communication that's required to manage your way through, as well as attachments, so supporting documentation for people, for example, blueprints or documentation that someone may need to prepare their specific store or facility for that particular event. So you launch your plan through Everbridge, and this is where automation is your friend. Automation really helps you prepare for the impending event. Your facilities can receive instruction in the form of task lists, and they can actually respond to you pertaining to specific issues they have with preparation. For example, I can't secure this particular window or door, or we have a flooding concern about this particular building or location. You can also automatically inform employees for what they should do, and this can go up to and including advising them to evacuate the area. Certainly, we want to give you the ability to check on your supply chain if that's something that is part of your business. We can let you know what suppliers and supply routes are potentially at risk from the storm, and we can provide a variety of collaboration features straight out of the platform. The ability to chat securely online via text, which so many people want to do these days, as well as the ability to join a conference bridge, collaborate with your team members as you're actually preparing for the storm to make landfall. I'd mentioned earlier positioning of first responders, and that's really key to our strategy as well. We want to give you the visibility into where those people and those assets may be, so that after the storm passes, you know where your response units are, you know what capabilities you have in any particular given area, and that just speeds your response. That speeds your ability to evaluate the case or the status of your assets and make sure that the things that are good, and the things that are bad are getting the appropriate attention that they deserve. Now, as the storm moves closer, typically you're going to have an evacuation plan, and often FEMA will go on TV and the radio and make announcements about evacuation plans. One of the great things about the platform is the ability to understand not only evacuation routes and where police stations and shelters and things like that are, but the ability to live monitor your evacuation routes. And here you're seeing I-95 northbound as it passes through Daytona Beach. This was during the Irma storm, and you can see that at this point in time, around the Daytona Beach area, we've got quite a bit of traffic backed up on I-95. So if your people are asking you what's the best way to get out of this area, you may want to guide them toward a different route at this particular point in time. Now, once the storm moves ashore, this is where we take many of the excellent products from the National Hurricane Center and other providers and can actually overlay them on the assets and things that are important to your organization. We can do things like wind modeling and storm surge modeling. And the surge modeling is actually pretty interesting here. The orange parts are where FEMA has specified during a Category 1 storm you may have an issue with storm surge or with flooding, and the green here is actually where the storm was pushing water due to its unique position and structure at the time of the event. So you can get very detailed about where your potential assets are, where your potential risk is to those assets, and what the conditions are like at any given time. And there are also a variety of other models, and of course access to traffic cameras and information can give you live data about the conditions in any given situation. Now, Everbridge, not only can we provide you with this information, but it's important to be able to communicate throughout the storm. And one of the very common things that happen during hurricanes is that tornadoes can be spawned. And this is a condition that can be certainly very dangerous to the people that are on the ground in that environment. So one of the great things that we can do is detect when one of these events is spawned out of a hurricane and actually begin to inform and notify people automatically about those conditions. So if you have folks that are in a facility and you need to advise them of a hurricane on the ground, again, automation is your friend. Everbridge acts like another member of your team, except it's quite more scalable than a person. It can send hundreds or thousands of messages almost instantly to people who are in that risk zone and advise them of what to do. It'll also manage the responses from those people. So if you ask people if they're okay, you'll get responses back from many people that they're fine, they're in shelter, they're not having an issue at the moment. The ones that you want to focus on are the people that respond that they're not okay or they need help, or the people that you haven't heard from at all. And that can really drive how you respond in the immediate aftermath of this event, because you know who and what you need to check on first and foremost. You know the priorities based on the communication that you're receiving back from the field. We also think it's important for employees to be able to report both non-emergency and emergency events, because that's, again, going to help you understand where you need to focus after the storm has passed. A non-emergency event might be flooding in a lobby or a building in general. I would argue that during when it's not a hurricane, you're probably you're probably more concerned about that flooding in the lobby. But during a hurricane, this is actually a relatively minor issue compared to, say, an emergency report, which we see on the right here. And this could be a facility has had a partial roof collapse or some other type of damage, and people are needing to evacuate that facility immediately and seek shelter elsewhere. The good thing here is that we offer a mobile app that allows you to do both these emergency and non-emergency type of reports. And in case of an emergency report, we could even share live audio and video with you. So you can see and hear what the individual who's hit that SOS button is actually experiencing at that point in time. Now, as I'm sure you all know, no storm occurs in a vacuum. Typically, management, your senior leadership team is going to want to be informed about what's happening. And with the Everbridge platform, you can provide dashboards or channels that the senior leadership can look into themselves without having to even contact you, as well as situation reports that will tell you what's happening, where you are in your preparation or in your management of the storm phases. And those can be scheduled to run hourly, every 3 hours, whatever makes sense for your particular organization. Now, when the storm moves away, this is where the information that you gathered and understood during the storm really starts to add value. You already have insight into where the worst of the damage may be. And this gives you the ability to execute your business recovery, your disaster recovery plans with a focus on those assets or people that were in the areas of the worst damage during the storm. Again, the platform can send out task lists that guide your first responders as they are triaging, as they're investigating the situation. And the goal there is really, again, to give everybody a clear sense and a clear purpose of what it is they need to do to achieve that objective of making sure that everybody's safe and that you can get back to business as soon as possible. And finally, after the storm, it's important for you to understand how your performance was during that storm. What gaps did you have in your response processes, and what went well during that storm response? You can pull a tremendous amount of information out of the platform that helps you evaluate your performance, identify any gaps in the process, and improve your process. So the next time a hurricane comes along, you've filled those gaps, you've closed them, and you're able to address those challenges in a better way than you did for this particular storm. With Everbridge CEM, we provide the ability to address a number of different use cases. This is, frankly, the end of the presentation from the perspective of the hurricanes. And I think, Christine, we're ready to take questions at this point.
Wonderful. Thanks, Greg. We do have some questions in here, and it looks like they are all going back to the forecast. So, Stephen, I have a few questions heading your way. The first one is, we have an audience member who is wondering if it is possible to forecast hurricanes a full year in advance.
Well, it kind of depends on what you consider, the forecast to be. In terms of overall trends of, a more or less active, season, there is some potential to do that. Obviously, in terms of a particular storm, there's really no way you can specifically forecast an individual storm that far in advance. Now, like this year, we are forecasting there to be an above average probability of a storm making landfall, over the southeast or eastern Gulf. And so something like you can kind of those type of generalities you can predict pretty far in advance. But in terms of trying to specify a major hurricane making landfall like on August 18th or something like that, a year in advance, there's really no ability to do that. Obviously, you can have a pretty high confidence if we do see a major hurricane, it's probably going to happen, within a month or so of the middle of September, just because that's climatologically when they happen. But in terms of specifics, no. But in terms of generalities, you can that far. Although obviously the ability to forecast things like El Nino and things of that nature, it gets hard to do beyond about 9 months or so, unless there's a clear-cut ENSO pattern. Like if you have a strong El Nino or a strong La Nina that is already in place, and you can kind of extrapolate that out. You can have a higher confidence in a forecast that far out. But generally speaking, it's hard to do a tropical sort of forecast beyond about 9 months and have a lot of confidence in terms of the overall trends, since most years the ENSO forecasts and things like that aren't quite as certain like they are in some other years.
It's interesting that you bring up El Nino. There's a few questions in here. People are asking, if we have had El Nino for the last year and you are expecting an above normal storm season, how can that be if we always thought that El Ninos meant fewer storms?
Right, and that's true. When we do see an El Nino, we do typically see fewer storms than average, and I have that slide that kind of compare the El Nino and the ENSO neutral and La Nina years. The key thing this year is that the El Nino that we've had, for one thing, it was quite weak, and for another, it's really transitioning out of El Nino at this point. The water temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific are already back down to near normal. The lingering warmth that is present is now kind of confined to the western part of the Pacific, and so the overall, El Nino regime that we've had in places, for the most part, faded out. There's still a little bit of lingering influence, but even that is sort of diminishing with time. And so while that may have had some suppression on the level of activity the first couple months of the season, with the El Nino largely fading out at this point, we likely should see a pattern more typical of a neutral ENSO year, one without an El Nino, going forward for the balance of the hurricane season, especially by the time we get to the latter part of August and through the remainder of the season after that.
Great, thank you. And then I think a lot of people on this call are very much interested in your forecast because they want to know what the impact is to their business and to their personal lives. So we have one person who's asking, they are located several hundred miles away from the coasts, and they're wondering if they need to worry if a hurricane does land.
Right. So the impacts you see are going to obviously, vary by where you're located and the type of storm you have. In terms of significant wind damage and things like that, typically that's going to be, within 50 miles of the coast or less, in terms of, the real intense damage. Obviously, storm surge is limited, to the immediate coastal areas or along rivers that might, be in close proximity to the ocean that are going to flood as well from a storm surge. As you get beyond that range, though, typically what you see as the biggest impact is flooding rainfall. And that was the case last year with Florence, and obviously we saw that with Harvey a couple years ago. And typically the areas that are farther inland see most of the damage from wide-scale flooding from hurricanes, which can produce on the order of 20, 30, or even more rain, like what Harvey did. So if you're located that far inland, a couple hundred miles inland, the risk for significant wind damage is low, although you can still have some tornadoes and that kind of thing that can produce localized damage. But the main thing you should be concerned about is whether your asset has the potential to flood. If you have a 20-inch rainfall in your area, are you located near a river that is likely to flood and that kind of thing? Since that's going to really be the main focus of damage potential if you're that far inland, is going to be flooding, and it's very common for hurricanes to produce flooding hundreds of miles inland because they can stall out and produce feet of rainfall well away from the coast. even though you don't have the wind damage potential anymore, the rainfall potential extends usually several hundred miles inland with most major storms.
Thank you. And I know that you touched upon this earlier in your presentation about the likelihood of Category 5 in the past, of how if they've actually made landfall. Do you think we'll see another Category 5 make landfall this year?
Now, Category 5s obviously are pretty rare. We've only seen 4 of those make landfall, across the U.S. since we've been keeping good tabs of those kind of things. Probably we've had some more in between, a long time ago that just weren't recorded, but it's certainly something that does not happen on a yearly basis. And so odds are we will not see a Category 5 make landfall this year just based on historical probability. The odds of that happening in any given year is something, it's going to be less than 5%, really more on the order of a couple percent. And so, that's sort of always a low probability, but the probability of a major hurricane making landfall, like a Category 3 or higher, is fairly good, again, because of the overall track or overall pattern that's going to favor tracks towards the U.S. and the warmer water in the Gulf and the Atlantic. There is probably a higher than 50% chance we're going to see a major hurricane make landfall on the U.S. coast again. But it's really rare to get a Category 5 to make landfall. So if we have a major hurricane, odds are it will be a 3 or maybe a 4, and not something that intense, although you can't rule that out. But typically, most major hurricanes that make landfall are, sort of in that Category 3 to low-end Category 4. That's the most common type of major hurricane that we typically see making landfall in the U.S., and that's typically that's what we would expect to see, in most years make landfall in terms of what the high-end storm is.
Great, and then we have time for one last question. It's along that vein. One of our attendees wants to know if hurricanes will trend more intense in the future.
Oh, that's kind of more of a climate type of question. Obviously, if we do see the tendency for water temperatures in the Gulf and the Atlantic to continue to stay elevated like they have been and trend warmer, then that's going to give storms that do develop the potential to be more intense as well, since really the main driving factor for hurricane intensity is water temperature. And you need a certain temperature of ocean water to kind of support, various levels of hurricane intensity. And so the warmer the water is, the more intense a hurricane has the potential to become. And so if the water temperature trends do stay, in an upward track like they have been, that would support the potential for, maybe a few more major hurricanes, what we've seen in the past. But if you looked at that trend that we showed the tendency in major hurricanes, there wasn't really much trend there. The overall impact of water temperature, unless we see a dramatic increase, if it just increases a degree or two, that might move the needle just a little bit. And so maybe your average storm strength increases, 5, 10, 15 miles an hour, something like that. And so while it may, on average, promote a little bit more intensity than what we've seen, we may not really see a dramatic change in terms of the number of like Category 3s or 4s or 5s that make landfall. It's going to be one of those things that's going to be kind of hard to tell, like in the data, unless you look at 100 years of data. It's probably going to be just a very small increase overall. But the overall tendency would be that we're going to see more hurricanes on average if we do see the warmer water persist like we have been over the last 20 years or so. So that would be the main thing to look for. Would just be more hurricanes on average. But to get the most intense hurricanes, a lot has to happen. You have to have, really low wind shear and just an overall favorable environment besides just the warm water. And so those storms in general are pretty rare. And so even if we do see a slight increase in those, it's not like we're going to probably go from, seeing, a Category 5 storm every, 20 years to seeing one every year. That's pretty unlikely. But we may see a slight increase in overall intensity of, several miles per hour on hurricanes. But a dramatic increase in the next couple of decades is probably not likely. But again, we could be seeing a few more hurricanes, or basically seeing at least a continuation of our current more active trends for the next coming decades.
Well, I guess that's good news, and we can only be prepared. So thank you so much for that. That is all the time we have for questions today. I'd like to thank Stephen, Michael, and Greg for all the information you presented today. It was wonderful. And then for the attendees, we will be following up after from Everbridge. Please look for an email. And then that concludes the 2019 Hurricane Forecast webinar for today. Thank you very much.